Before modern borders, before Israel or Palestine existed as states, this land changed hands again and again. Empires rose, collapsed, and were replaced. Administrations changed. Names changed. Populations mixed, adapted, and endured. History here is not a story of eternal ownership. It's a record of control, loss, and continuity. Territories don't remain stable because of memory or belief. They remain stable because someone can govern them, defend them, and absorb the cost of doing so. This is not a video about who is right or wrong today. It's about what existed before 1948 and the patterns that shaped everything that came after. Do you accept the cost? Subscribe to the channel. This is where power, history, and technology are examined without comfort. Long before modern borders, flags, or national identities, the land between the Mediterranean coast and the Jordan Valley was a crossroads. Its geography made it valuable and therefore vulnerable. Trade routes, fertile corridors, and access between continents meant this territory was rarely isolated and almost never independent for long. In the ancient world, the region was inhabited by a mosaic of peoples. Canaanites, Philistines, Israelites, and other local groups lived there across centuries, often overlapping rather than replacing one another. Political authority shifted frequently, but population change was usually gradual, not absolute. Continuity existed, but never in isolation. What mattered most was not ethnic identity, but who could impose order. Empires from outside the region repeatedly asserted control. Egyptian influence reached into the Levant. Later, Mesopotamian powers, such as the Assyrians and Babylonians, incorporated the territory into larger imperial systems. Each conquest altered administration and elites, but rarely emptied the land of its inhabitants. Rule changed faster than people did. By the time the region came under Hellenistic influence after Alexander's conquests, it had already experienced centuries of external domination. Local religious and cultural traditions persisted, adapted, and sometimes resisted, but sovereignty remained fragile. This pattern reached a turning point with the expansion of the Roman Empire. Rome did not conquer the region to create a homeland for any group. It conquered it to stabilize a frontier and secure imperial interests. The land was absorbed into a vast administrative machine, governed from afar, and valued primarily for its strategic position. Under Roman rule, the territory was no longer a center of power. It was a province. Revolts occurred, some violent and costly, reflecting tensions between local autonomy and imperial authority. Rome responded not with negotiation, but with restructuring. Administrative boundaries were redrawn. Names were changed. Governance became more centralized. The goal was not reconciliation, but control. Yet even then, the region was not emptied or erased. Communities remained. Religious traditions survived. Population continuity persisted alongside political subordination. This is a recurring historical pattern. Conquest does not require total displacement to be effective. Control is maintained through administration, taxation, and force, not necessarily demographic replacement. By the end of Roman dominance, the land had already been shaped by a long sequence of rulers and systems. No uninterrupted sovereignty, no single continuous state, and no permanent monopoly over the territory had existed. What endured was the land itself and the human presence upon it, adapting to whoever held power. This is the foundation upon which everything that followed was built. The decline of Roman authority in the Eastern Mediterranean did not bring independence to the land. Instead, it marked a transition from classical imperial rule to a Christian imperial system centered in Constantinople. What changed was not the logic of power, but its cultural and religious framework. Under what historians call the Byzantine period, the territory remained firmly embedded within the structures of the Byzantine Empire. Administration continued through provinces, taxation persisted, and imperial authority remained distant from local populations. The land was governed, not self-determined. One common misconception is that this era represented a sharp rupture in population. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests otherwise. Villages, agricultural patterns, and urban centers show continuity from late Roman times. People did not vanish. Governance shifted above them. Religious affiliation evolved gradually, not instantaneously. Christianity became the dominant public religion of the empire, reshaping institutions, law, and urban life. Churches replaced temples as civic centers. Pilgrimage routes expanded. Jerusalem, in particular, gained symbolic importance within the Christian world. Yet symbolic elevation did not equate to political autonomy. The city's significance was spiritual, not sovereign. Jewish communities persisted throughout this period, though often marginalized and restricted. Their presence was uneven, shaped by imperial policy rather than elimination. Meanwhile, large segments of the population remained locally rooted farmers and townspeople whose identities were more regional than ideological. This period illustrates a recurring historical pattern. Empires can transform cultural landscapes without fundamentally altering demographic foundations. Conversion, assimilation, and adaptation unfolded across generations. The land's population changed in belief systems faster than it changed in composition. Crucially, the Byzantine state did not conceptualize territory in national terms. The land was not governed as a homeland for a people, but as a strategic and symbolic province of a larger imperial order. Borders mattered for defense and taxation, not identity. By the early 7th century, the region was economically strained and politically vulnerable. Prolonged wars between Byzantium and Persia weakened imperial control. Garrisons thinned. Administrative cohesion declined. The empire still claimed the territory, but its capacity to effectively hold it was eroding. This moment matters because it reinforces a key historical principle. Sovereignty is not maintained by claims alone, but by sustained capacity. When imperial structures weaken, territory becomes exposed to transition. By the end of the Byzantine period in the Levant, no independent state had emerged, and no exclusive ethnic sovereignty had been established. The land remained what it had been for centuries, governed from afar, inhabited continuously, and shaped by forces larger than the populations living upon it. This is not a story of disappearance or replacement. It is a story of endurance beneath changing rulers, a pattern that would repeat once again in the centuries to come. The Islamic conquest of the Levant in the 7th century marked another major shift in sovereignty, but not a demographic rupture. As with earlier transitions, power changed hands faster than populations did. By the early 600s, the region was exhausted. Decades of warfare between the Byzantine Empire and Persia had drained resources, weakened garrisons, and disrupted administration. When Arab armies emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, they encountered territories that were politically fragile rather than densely defended. The initial conquest unfolded rapidly. Within a few years, Byzantine authority collapsed across much of the Levant, and the region was absorbed into the expanding Rashidun Caliphate, later consolidated under the Umayyad administration. The change was decisive at the level of sovereignty, but limited at the level of everyday life. Contrary to later nationalist narratives, the conquest did not involve mass population replacement. Rural communities remained where they were. Cities continued to function. Agricultural production persisted. What changed was the ruling elite, the language of administration, and the legal framework governing the territory. Islam did not instantly become the dominant religion of the population. Conversion was gradual, unfolding over generations. For centuries, Christians and Jews constituted substantial portions of the region's inhabitants. Religious identity evolved through social, economic, and legal incentives, not immediate coercion or displacement. This reflects a broader imperial pattern. Conquerors prioritized stability and revenue over demographic transformation. The new Islamic administration taxed non-Muslim communities, integrated local elites where possible, and focused on maintaining order. The land was valuable not as an ethnic homeland, but as a functioning province within a growing empire. Jerusalem's status changed symbolically, but not administratively. It became a city of religious importance within Islam, yet remained governed as part of a broader regional structure. No independent state emerged. No exclusive sovereignty was claimed in national terms. Authority flowed outward, toward imperial centers. Over time, Arabic replaced Greek and other languages in official use. Legal norms shifted, cultural landscapes adjusted. Yet the human foundation beneath these changes remained largely continuous. Villages endured. Families adapted. Identities layered rather than vanished. This period reinforces a central historical principle. Conquest does not require eradication to succeed. Control is established through administration, taxation, and legitimacy, not necessarily through population replacement. By the end of the 7th century, the territory that would later become central to modern disputes had once again passed into a new imperial system. The names changed. The symbols changed. The rulers changed. The land remained inhabited, cultivated, and governed by powers beyond itself. This was not the beginning of a permanent order, but another chapter in a long sequence of transitions, a sequence shaped less by belonging than by the capacity to rule. From the late 11th century onward, the region entered a period of intensified imperial competition. Unlike earlier transitions, this phase introduced repeated cycles of military disruption, layered on top of long-term administrative continuity. The Crusades did not emerge from local dynamics. They were external military expeditions launched from Europe, driven by religious ideology and strategic ambition. When Crusader states were established along the Levantine coast, they represented a sharp break in sovereignty, but a shallow one in demographic terms. These were militarized enclaves, dependent on constant reinforcement from abroad and sustained by fortified control rather than broad integration. Local populations did not disappear. Rural life continued largely unchanged beyond fortified zones. The Crusader presence remained urban, coastal, and elite-driven. Their rule was fragile by design, and once military support weakened, it collapsed quickly. By the late 12th century, regional powers reasserted control. Authority shifted to Islamic dynasties such as the Ayyubids and later the Mamluk Sultanate. These regimes did not seek to erase what came before, but to reabsorb territory into familiar imperial structures, taxation, military administration, and centralized authority. The pattern repeats. Conquest alters rulers, not populations. For centuries afterward, the land remained part of larger political systems whose centers lay elsewhere: Cairo, Damascus, Istanbul. The region was governed as a peripheral but strategic zone, not as a national core. No sovereign state emerged from within the territory itself. This dynamic reached its most durable form under the Ottoman Empire, which absorbed the region in the early 16th century. Ottoman rule would last for roughly 400 years, longer than any previous continuous administration in the area. Ottoman governance was pragmatic. Local communities retained religious autonomy under imperial oversight. Land was administered through tax systems designed to extract revenue, not engineer identity. The empire was multi-ethnic and multi-religious by necessity, and its survival depended on managing diversity rather than eliminating it. Crucially, the Ottomans did not conceptualize the land as a nation. There was no Palestine as a sovereign state, nor an Israel as a modern political entity. The territory existed as a set of districts within a vast imperial framework, its borders administrative rather than national. Population continuity remained the norm. Villages persisted. Cities evolved slowly. Migration occurred, but not at a scale that replaced the existing human landscape. Identity was shaped locally, by religion, profession, and region, more than by abstract nationalism. This long imperial phase matters because it demonstrates a central historical rule. Stability does not require national sovereignty. For centuries, the land functioned without a state of its own, governed instead by distant empires that valued order and revenue over identity politics. By the time Ottoman authority began to weaken in the 19th century, the territory had already spent nearly a millennium under successive imperial systems. What followed would not be a return to an older order, but the collision between imperial collapse and modern nationalism. That collision would redefine everything. By the 19th century, the imperial framework that had governed the region for centuries began to fracture. The issue was not sudden rebellion from within the land itself, but systemic weakness across the empires that ruled it. Administrative inertia, economic strain, and external pressure gradually eroded the ability of imperial authorities to maintain cohesion. For most of this period, the territory remained what it had long been, a peripheral province governed from afar. Local society was overwhelmingly rural, organized around villages, religious communities, and regional ties rather than national identity. Loyalty was directed toward family, faith, and locality, not toward abstract political projects. What changed in the 19th century was not the land, but the world around it. Across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, modern nationalism emerged as a new political force. Identity began to shift from imperial belonging to the idea of a people tied to territory. This was a fundamental rupture from earlier systems, where sovereignty flowed downward from empire rather than upward from population. The region did not generate this transformation internally. Nationalism arrived from outside, carried by global currents. European political thought, missionary networks, trade, and imperial rivalry. As the old imperial order weakened, external powers increasingly treated the land not as a stable province, but as an asset within a broader geopolitical contest. At the same time, demographic change accelerated, migration increased, driven by economic opportunity, religious motivation, and imperial decline. Land purchases expanded, urban centers grew. None of this occurred in a vacuum, but none of it produced a sovereign state either. Crucially, by the late 19th century, the territory was caught between two realities. On the ground, it remained administratively imperial and socially local. In theory, however, it was being reimagined through modern political frameworks that demanded borders, nations, and sovereignty. This mismatch mattered. The imperial system had provided stability without nationhood. Nationalism, by contrast, demanded nationhood without a state. As imperial authority weakened, no local structure existed capable of absorbing that transition smoothly. The result was not immediate conflict, but structural instability. The land entered the 20th century without an independent government, without fixed national borders, and without a unified political identity. What it had instead was a collapsing imperial umbrella, an increasing external interest in determining its future. This is a critical historical moment. Collapse does not create sovereignty by default, it creates a vacuum. And vacuums are rarely filled by consensus. By the end of the 19th century, the patterns that had governed the land for centuries, distant rule, administrative continuity, and local endurance, were breaking down. What replaced them was not yet a state, but a question. Who would inherit authority once empire fully receded? That question would define the next stage of the territory's history and push it toward the decisive rupture that followed. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War marked the definitive end of imperial continuity in the region. For the first time in centuries, the land was no longer governed by a multi-ethnic empire rooted in long-term administration. Instead, it entered a transitional phase under the British Mandate for Palestine, a framework designed not to rule permanently, but to manage an unresolved future. Unlike previous imperial systems, the mandate did not rest on historical legitimacy or organic integration. It was an external administrative solution imposed after imperial collapse, shaped by wartime promises, international diplomacy, and strategic calculation. Authority existed, but sovereignty did not. This distinction mattered. The British administration inherited a territory with no independent state tradition, no fixed borders defined by national consensus, and no unified political identity. What it faced instead were overlapping populations, competing expectations, and rising nationalist movements shaped by forces far beyond the land itself. Under the Mandate, modern political concepts accelerated. Census-taking, borders, legal codification, and centralized governance introduced a new relationship between territory and identity. At the same time, migration increased, land ownership patterns shifted, and political organizations expanded. The land was no longer governed as a passive province. It was being prepared, intentionally or not, for statehood. Yet preparation did not mean resolution. The Mandate system attempted to balance incompatible objectives. It promised order without sovereignty, reform without self-rule, and stability without consensus. As imperial authority weakened globally, the limits of external administration became increasingly visible. What had once been managed by empire was now contested by competing national projects. Crucially, this period did not resolve historical claims. It formalized them. Administrative decisions hardened political identities. Ambiguity gave way to confrontation. The long-standing pattern of distant rule without local sovereignty reached its breaking point. By the late 1940s, the Mandate had exhausted its purpose. Britain no longer possessed the capacity or legitimacy to govern the territory. The imperial age was over. What followed was not a smooth transition, but a rupture. In 1948, the question that had been deferred for centuries could no longer be postponed. Who would exercise sovereign power over the land? This is where the historical record you've just seen ends. Up to this moment, we've traced a territory shaped by empires, administration, and continuity beneath changing rulers. What comes next belongs to a different category of history, one defined not by imperial control, but by modern statehood, war, and survival. That story begins after 1948, and it demands a different lens. In the next video, we move beyond territory and administration and into conflict.